I'm Lisa Moore Ramee. Welcome to the Balance Beam panel. We are here talking with some fantastic middle grade authors about the use of levity in books that consider some kind of tough topics. And I thought we would just jump right in with quick go round of introductions. If you wouldn't mind just saying your name and the title of your book.
Would you like me to start?
Sure. Go ahead, Donna.
I'm Donna Higuera, and this is my book, Lupe Wong Won't Dance, which comes out September 8th with Living Querido.
Hi, I'm Chrystal Giles. My book is Take Back the Block. It is out January 26th from Random House Children's Books.
Hey, I'm Cathleen Barnhart. My book is That's What Friends Do. It came out on January 28th, 2020.
Hi, I'm Lindsay Lackey, and my book is All the Impossible Things, and it came out in September of 2019 from Macmillan, so it's already in the world. Scary.
Hi, everybody. I'm Jennie Englund, author of Taylor Before and After, which came out in February, also with Macmillan. So Lindsay and I are Macmillan sisters. I'm Imprint.
Well, welcome everyone, and thank you so much for agreeing to chat with me today. I have some questions for you, so let's get started. The first question goes right to kind of the heart of the topic of this panel. I would say that all of your books kind of have run the gamut of how much or how little they use levity to balance out the tough topic. So I just wanted you to each talk about how you saw the use of levity in your work and how important it was to carry out the story.
So I think that there's a lot of humor in my book, more so than I think a lot of people's, but the serious topic that came up in my book came up naturally. I think the book started out as a more humorous work, and then the serious topics came out. But when I was writing it, when those things happened, where the topics were more serious and the character was faced with something that was more challenging, as I was writing it, I realized nobody reading wants to be under stress continuously for too long of a length of time. So I think finding the balance of humor, especially when writing for middle graders, is important because I think kids want to laugh. And when you have a serious topic, if you can find that balance with a little bit of humor, it helps those topics be more palatable to a reader.
For my story, I'm probably on the milder side of levity. The topic I dive straight into, it's a little tough. I found though that my characters were just naturally kind of funny, a little sarcastic. They grew up in the same neighborhood, so they know each other. So there's a lot of joking around and a lot of kind of poking with each other. I think it really brought the community into understanding how important the community was to the story. So that was important for me. I think also a little bit of humor makes it more accessible. Like Donna said, to a young reader in books with tough topics. Mine had a lot of pieces that were just educational, and I didn't want to bore the reader. But then also I wanted to really inject the character's voice. And in some ways it just was kind of sarcastically funny.
Yeah, Wes is very, very sarcastic. I loved that.
I am not a funny person, and so I'm not quick. I don't come up with humorous things. I'm just not funny. So I really wanted to write funny. I don't think my book is not hilarious like Donna's. It doesn't have those great lines, but I was really trying to write a character who had a sense of humor and a character who would make readers smile and laugh. I also felt for David in my book that if he was funny, that it would be easier for readers to relate to him and to have sympathy for him. And since it is covering this more difficult topic, I wanted him to have that humor so that readers would feel sympathy for him. So
I think you did that really well, Kathleen. I think David was definitely the levity in your story, that thread. So that was great. My book is about, I'll tell you the topic so it's not a mystery. My book is about a girl who's in foster care, and her mother is in jail and is released from jail. And so she's trying to become family with her mom again, but her mom struggles with drug addiction. So it's a pretty heavy topic if you look at it from that angle, but I actually don't think of my book as heavy at all, really, because I think I just put a lot of hope into it. And for me, that's where levity comes from, I guess. In any story, no matter how dark it is, if there's hope, then that I think really balances it out. And I love that about middle grade, because there's so much hope and light and joy in middle grade. In YA, you can get a little bit angsty and it can stay pretty dark in the YA world. But I love that middle grade, there's almost always this element of, even if the story doesn't end the way that you want it to necessarily, there's always this element of joy. So for me, one of the ways I infused that was humor, like Donna said, and I love, Chrystal, you said community as well. That was a big part of how I inserted levity into my story, through the community around this little girl. But also for me was animals. That was a big, that was a very easy way into the levity for my story. My character goes to live with a foster family that has a petting zoo. So there are all these crazy animals. There's a goat that climbs trees and a donkey that feeds chickens. And there's this 400-pound tortoise that sneezes and it's disgusting. So I think little moments like that, I was really able to, in the writing of it, find a lot of joy in the animals in my book.
I was hoping you were going to say the animals brought some levity, because I loved the donkey and the turtle and the pets in your book. So, like Kathleen, I put a sidekick in mine who was a little bit funnier. Taylor is a book about depression and death and loss. So I kind of think the universe ranked us, because I read everybody's books, and I think in the order we win is the order of levity we have. That's what I found.
Absolutely.
Donna's is huge. Chrystal, I thought yours was big, and it kind of, wanes by the time it's me. I could have had a lot more levity. But I tried to use, like Lindsay, pets. I used one cat, and that is my cat. It's the only true character in the book, is this cat that loves enchiladas and lasagna. So
I love that cat and then, so much.
Pardon?
I loved that cat. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you. That was one of my favorite parts of the book.
That's my cat. So if anybody asks me, are any of the characters real? Yes, there is one, and it's Kit Kat, and that is her in there. So, but I think using a funny sidekick, I find my villain funny. She says funny things. I think you can have different kinds of funny. You can have snarky funny, that ironic, sharp, she calls it a fish kicking island, using word choice and vocabulary, or jealous funny, or clumsy funny. When my character goes in for a kiss, it just doesn't work out very well. I mean, does it ever? So next
you also had the references to the competition shows, which I found, now maybe it's because I love those shows, but I was like, oh, this is really clever and also really funny.
Oh, nice. Thank you.
Yeah, there were nice parallels between Survivor and middle school.
Yeah, for sure.
Well, that idea came from an essay I found so many years ago that I haven't been able to find again. And it's about our culture of exclusion and how those shows just foster being left out. and how that translates down to schools.
Yeah, that's really true.
I'm hoping, and some of you have already touched on this, but I wanted to talk about the difficulty of including a more lighthearted component into books that are touching on such serious things. And if you, one of the things that I'm hoping that you'll maybe touch on when you answer that is kind of thinking about it from a craft perspective. I think that, it's always interesting for young writers to hear how experienced writers actually, take apart or approach the crafting process. So if you all wouldn't mind sharing maybe what the serious topic is, a couple of you have already, that your book focuses on, and then talk about how difficult it was or not to include the more lighthearted pieces of your book.
I'm assuming we're going in the same order.
We'll go in the same order. So we'll start with you again, Donna.
So, there's a couple of topics in my book, but one of them is kind of what Jennie just mentioned, is exclusivity and racism. And it didn't really come up. I didn't write the book with that in mind. It came up kind of organically, and the book was humorous all along. And writing, like the craft of writing humor, it can either be really, really difficult if you try to shoehorn it in, or it can just come naturally. And these characters were just funny in my book, and they just kind of took off on their own. But the topic of racism came up, and that was difficult. And a lot of it had to do with square dancing, and how when I was a kid, I was like, what in the heck does this have to do with me? And in realizing it's still like the official dance in 28 states, and that like 50% of middle schools still have square dancing as their curriculum. And a lot of the lyrics have their base in racism. And that came about through just Google search, me doing, and I'm like, my character would have done a Google search to try to get rid of square dancing, which she does. So this is something she would have stumbled upon. So while I was writing the book, I'm like, oh, geez, now I can't leave it out. I have to bring this up. There was also, there have been a couple of scenes in the book, things I experienced as a child being mixed race, and I had to bring those up. And even though those can be jarring, and some of my critique partners at some point said, those are jarring. I'm like, yeah, but that really happens. And they weren't jarring to me, because I'm like, that just stuff happens. But they're woven in with humor, because that's what my life is. And the two aren't, they're so interwoven. They're not exclusive from one another. So that's a tricky question for me, because I think that they come hand in hand. And I know that's a weird answer, but tough topics and humor, a lot of times, for someone like myself who doesn't handle difficulties very well, humor is a way to kind of cushion the blow of a lot of that stuff.
So for me, my story is about gentrification, and about a neighborhood where my main character, Wes, grew up there from childhood. And he also happens to be born into a family of activists. And he does not like it. So he would rather just be doing regular everyday things like basketball or video games. And so he spends a lot of his free time marching. And so the story really starts there. And then after his neighborhood is targeted by a developer, suddenly he has to turn on his activism, and it gets personal for him. So the plot of the story kind of flipped from Donna. The plot of the story was what I started with, and then the character piece kind of folded thereafter. And I knew I was going to have to come up with some fun characters. I've got a funny side character, Brent, who kind of brings kind of that best friend that always has the funny thing or the mean thing to say. And that was fairly easy. The harder part was the pacing of the story. And so there's a lot of loss in this community. And toward the end of the story, it just kind of felt like loss after loss. And so injecting some breaks for the characters, and then also for the main character. You know, at a point, I myself had felt really, really bad for Wes because he had so many losses back to back. And so the pacing of those losses was the more challenging part, to make sure that we aren't just piling on the hard stuff. So injecting those kind of breaks and those breaths for the reader and also for the characters. So that was probably the more challenging part. The kids interacting with each other, that wasn't that bad at all. We actually had to cut some of those scenes, and it kind of broke my heart to not have them picking at each other. So that wasn't as hard. The pacing toward the end got a little hard for me though.
That's What Friends Do is the story of a 7th grade girl's first Me Too experience. That's the heavy topic that's at the center of the story. But I was always thinking about and looking at that moment, that experience, from both Sammy, the girl's point of view, and David, her best friend's point of view, and through his eyes. So from the beginning, his voice was there, and his voice was the lighter, sort of funnier voice. So it wasn't for me a question of injecting something in there. It really, both pieces of the story, the serious, difficult heart, and this sort of lighter, humorous voice, were there from the beginning for me. I did, in revisions, particularly in later revisions, sort of think like I put David in some situations, both to show who he was as a person, but also with the idea of them being humorous. At one point, he's working up, or he's trying to work up to maybe try to kiss Sammy, and he practices, and he gets caught practicing with his sister's SpongeBob SquarePants pillow. And that happened, that scene was added in later on, but I felt it was real to who he was, and it advanced the story. It was important in the story, and I thought it was funny. So.
It was very funny. It was hilarious.
It's funny, Kathleen, that you say you're not a funny person, because when I was reading it, especially that scene, I was like, I love the way this woman's mind works. Like, I love that you were thinking of him making out with a SpongeBob SquarePants, because, I mean, that just seems so real, but awkward and like wonderful at the same time. So I loved that. That was pretty great.
Thank you.
Also going back to what Donna was saying, that how like joy and pain are kind of, they go together, the humor and the hard topics, you sort of need one to have the other in existence at all. That's actually a really big theme in my book. The idea of these two separate emotions that seem like they don't go together, it's what carries you through life. I mean, you can't have light without dark. You can't have shadows without sun. You can't have humor without pain. And I think that ability we have of being able to find humor and laugh at things is finding it in those moments that are really awkward because you get caught making out with SpongeBob SquarePants, or really kind of, devastating because you're in a new foster family, but then suddenly the tortoise sneezes and you get turtle snot all over you, so those moments where you can kind of balance the hardship and the love and the joy, I think that's so necessary. So it's almost as if the more serious a topic you're exploring, the more opportunity you really do have for little moments of humor. And I think that everybody else has said it so well, and your books all do that so well. So it's really nice.
I agree with Lindsay completely that any awkward situation lends itself to some yikes, but also some giggles. And I feel like I tried to use some risk taking in Taylor Before and After, and when any character took a risk, it usually didn't end well. And I think that's kind of real, like Kathleen and Lindsay both said. We take all these risks, but it doesn't end the way we think it will or want it to. So being a little bit unpredictable helped me out. The scene I wrote in the cafeteria toward the front where Taylor tries to be mean to just a boy in her math class, it goes all kinds of bad because she's just not that person. So I think humor we can use to highlight the negative, but we can also try to use some risk taking and make it all clumsy and awkward. And I think people really like that. They don't feel so alone.
Yeah, thank you. I'm gonna ask each of you questions specific to your books. I had another question that was for all of you. I'm gonna kind of wrap it into the specific ones because I just want to make sure that, mainly because I want answers to my questions, so I want to make sure I get a chance to ask them all. So there were things that I noted about each book that I just was curious about and was hoping that you would talk more about. And so I'm hoping, Jennie, that you can talk to us about the format you used for your book of putting it in the form of journal entries and how those are and were shown the passage of time or going back in time by the seasons. And so I just wanted you to talk about what made you choose that and how that helped to move the story along.
Well, it was hard, and it's probably not easy to read because depression isn't easy to go through, and depression isn't a linear journey. Memory is foggy, and moving forward is difficult, and you don't always. So I did want to show this back and forth. I also, if I started with only before the tragedy, it would have been really unfair to the reader, thinking they got this book on that was completely light. You know, she likes fashion and talks about mongeese, I don't know, but and then to just kind of punch the reader with, now this happened and she's a completely different person. I didn't think anybody, any reader, either one would like that. We're different people when things happen to us. But the story also came from, format wise, I'm a research writing teacher at a college. And one day I gave a writing prompt on something that the students were supposed to read. And a mother of a grown son who he had just gone into prison, she let go of the entire writing prompt and wrote her own story about how her washing machine flooded and how devastated she was. And it really was just kind of the straw that broke the camel's back. And I thought how foolish I've been to have all these writing prompts and lock these students in. They really need some freedom to just get their words and their feelings down on paper and work that out. So there was all of that going on with the writing prompts, but I had a good time with it. It was hard. It was maybe interesting.
Oh, it was totally interesting. I so felt for them. And I loved that. Like that she's responding to a prompt. I thought that was really original. Okay, so I have a question for Kathleen, and I'm reformatting a little bit because you've already talked. I was really wanting to hear more about the double point of view, and you have mentioned that, but I think because of what the topic is, it becomes even more interesting, the fact that there's this dual point of view going on, and that you have someone who is, the victim, and someone who is the aggressor, even if an unintentional aggressor. And I think it would have been such a different book if written from one point of view or the other. But I wanted to, were you compelled to write it from two points of view for that reason? Or were there other reasons that went into having both points of view? Was it always a dual point of view story?
So initially, it was 3 points of view. I had Luke also as a narrator.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. And then I had an agent at a conference who read like 40 pages who said, I think you have to pick one point of view. And it actually stopped me. I really spent several months writing something else and wrestling with what to do about the point of view in That's What Friends Do. And in the end, I decided that Luke was a catalyst. He was not a main character, but that both Sammy and David's voices needed to be heard. I think that we've come a long way talking about Me Too experiences. And the Me Too movement, I had started writing this book before Me Too was a hashtag. But I think that what we still haven't fully addressed, or we're really only beginning to address, are the messages that we give as a society to young boys about how they're supposed to behave and what they're supposed to do and how they're supposed to be aggressors. I think that those messages come through in the way we dress little girls and little boys. I mean, little, 1 and 2 year olds are getting dressed in ways that that send a message about behavior and aggression and passivity and sweetness, right? And so I felt that I just didn't want to write a book that was going to feed into a sort of a victim bully narrative, because I think there absolutely are victim bully situations in middle school, in workplaces. There are, aggressors, egregious aggressors, but not every 7th grade boy who makes a mistake in his behavior is that aggressor. Some of them, again, they're trying to figure out what the right thing to do is, or how to do the right thing in a society where they're really being asked to be, to be the one who makes the first move, to be the one who asks the girl out. So that for me, those two voices had to be there to tell the story that I thought was the story I wanted to tell.
Yeah, I loved that you had the dual point of view. I would have actually loved to have had the 3 points. That would have been really cool. But I also liked the fact that you have, you don't let David off the hook. Like, even though it's an accident, but you didn't shy away from making it still be wrong, and him continuing to kind of make his mistake worse. I thought that was just really,
really he knows he's done something wrong, and instead of sort of owning up to it, that's I feel where he really goes wrong. Instead of owning up to it, he can't even acknowledge to himself that he's done this thing that's wrong, and he then makes it worse.
Right.
So yeah.
Okay, Chrystal, on to your book, which of course, it's funny. It's Kathleen just mentioned that, of course, she was writing this before Me Too hashtag. You were probably, of course, you were writing your book prior to there being, a lot of protests going on, because of how long it takes books to come out. But can you talk about kind of the timeliness of the book, and I guess kind of working backwards? I mean, what made you consider that as a topic? Because obviously you considered it prior to being this issue of a lot of protesting going on.
Right. So I had absolutely, I'm kind of thrilled in a way, and then also sad in a way that we're in the middle of an uprising. And the book is coming out. Of course, like you said, I couldn't have timed it at all. So I wrote this book probably 3-4 years ago. So I'm happy in a way because I feel like people are holding hands and we're protesting together, and it's now looked at as an acceptable and a part of civil discourse that can really make things happen. And so I'm happy for that front. I think also children are involved in protests now more than ever before. There's tons of books out now where, you know, people take their children to protest. I think in communities of color, that has been the case for decades, but now it seems like we get it, right? That you can have your whole family, your whole community protest something and it be meaningful. So I'm happy from that perspective. Part of me still feels a little sad that a lot of this stuff is still relevant, right? That we're still fighting for and screaming about the same type of issues. So that part makes it a little sad. My book does cover some racial things. It covers some privilege aspects, but the main plot is really about gentrification and history and heritage and preserving those things. And so the topic actually came to me just in the community that I live in. I live in Charlotte, North Carolina, and I've grown up here my whole life. And so when I visit parts of the city that I haven't seen in a while, it's totally different. And I imagine just like any major city in this country, it's probably the same thing. But it really started to bother me that whole communities were just gone, like no remnants of what it was before. And I really started to think about the children and families and what happens. And so that really just started to become a factor that I couldn't get away from. I mean, if you know me in my personal life, my husband and friends and family would probably get tired of me saying, "Oh my goodness, can you believe that place is gone?" And so it became a thing that I just kind of wanted to pursue. And then also in my city, as with a lot of cities, if you have high levels of gentrification, you don't have affordable housing. And so there's like people being displaced and then they don't have anywhere to go. So the story felt pertinent and relevant, and I needed to write it. And then it just so happened that all of these uprisings came right before the release. And so what can I say about the timing, you know?
Yeah, seriously.
Yeah.
Lindsay, there's so many things that I love about All the Impossible Things. And one of the big things is the impossible things. I thought that it was such a clever thing to introduce, very original concept of having this journal of impossible things that aren't actually impossible, which I think is like such a cool thing for a young person to read. But it's so cool that I had to ask you about where did that come from? How did you think of this idea of this list of things? Did that come before the story idea? About that.
Well, the story, the main heart of the story, which is the foster care story, was inspired by my family. My aunt and uncle were middle-aged. They had grown children. They even had grandchildren, and they decided to become foster parents. And so that was really inspirational to me to see that side of the story. So I already knew I was writing a story about a little girl who was in foster care. And I was probably maybe a third of the way into the very initial draft on it. And one morning I woke up and I just had the phrase, "all the impossible things" in my head. And I thought, oh man, that's a good title. And so of course I Googled it, because this is my writer advice to everyone in the world. Google the title you're thinking of. and see if it's out there already. And there was no book called All the Impossible Things. I couldn't believe it. And so I was like, all right, that's going to be my title. But I knew as soon as that was my title that, one, I had to incorporate impossible things. And two, I had absolutely no idea how to do that. And so I just sort of was trying to think how impossible things would play a role. And I knew that this little girl felt like her life was impossible, that being a family with her mom was impossible. And so I thought, what if she collects impossible things? Because there are so many things in this world that we think of as impossible that aren't, or we say, oh, that's impossible. And then we go out and do it the next day or whatever. So things like bumblebees being able to fly. All of my life, I heard that's impossible. Bumblebees shouldn't be able to fly, but they do. And there was no real explanation for that. And so I thought, what is that? So I looked it up, and this goes back into the thing, what Donna was talking about with the two living with hope and joy or grief and joy at the same time. A bumblebee actually creates a vortex under its wings when it flies because of how they flap. And it actually creates two, one under each wing. And so a bumblebee is lifted by two tornadoes that carry it around and make it fly all funny. And that was just like the most beautiful metaphor. And I knew, okay, this list of impossible things, this is what I'm doing. And so then it was fun to just think of things that once seemed impossible, like going to the moon once seemed super impossible. Now we know it's not, Then it actually got kind of challenging too. If you search online for impossible things, a lot of the stuff that comes up is just junk. It's not something that is remotely interesting or whatever. So I had to do a little bit of brain teaser activity to try and find all the impossible things that ended up in the list. But so that was it. Coming up with the actual origin story for how she kept the notebook was probably the hardest part of writing the draft, because I knew I wanted to fit this notebook idea in there. And then I was shoving a square peg into a round hole for 4 or 5 drafts trying to get this to work. And I finally, with help from my agent, finally got it to really work. So that was a relief when it finally worked, because I did not want to cut that darling. I was like, no, she has to collect impossible things. So that's where it came from.
Oh, that's awesome. Donna, I was going to ask you about humor and whether it was already a funny book, but when you first started writing it, but you've already really answered that. So I'm wondering if instead you can talk more about the fact, you touched on this a little bit, the racism that is found in the book, and that the main character Lupe discovers about square dancing, and how much of that did you know when you went in writing the book, or was it something that you discovered as you were writing? Did you already think oh, I'm going to have her do something that's hateful, and then it's oh, square dancing, and only to find that there was this history?
I love this question. So none of that was in the book initially. And my agent, Allison Remchek, when she read the book, she said, did you read that NPR article ever about the ice cream song? And I was like, oh no, here we go. So I Googled this NPR article, and it's absolutely the same thing that Lupe would have done, because she's trying to get rid of square dancing with a PowerPoint presentation. And she would have Googled it and found this NPR article. And it talks about how, early, even record companies were recording these songs with these horrific lyrics. And it was in this article, and it was something once somebody hears that, and those words that's all they're going to hear in their head. And that's kind of what happens with Lupe, where she's like, okay, now that I've heard this, I can't unhear it. How am I going to change it? So part of it, no, I didn't know any of it. So to answer your question, it came up. And then once it did, I had to rewrite the book. But I'm glad I did, because it was an integral part and it needed to be there. Lupe's a character that's kind of me and my kids, and experiences some of the things that we have. But that specific incident in the book was not there. And that was something that came out just after the book was written. It was just a revision I did with my agent. And so, yeah, it wasn't there, but I'm glad that we found it, because it turned the book in a completely different direction. And there are parts of her finding that article that are still funny, but when she finds it, that was one thing that was jarring to me, because I was like, wow. And I don't think a lot of people know about this. And if they were to just Google it and read about it, it is startling. And we hear these songs all the time and we don't think anything of them, and we dance to them. And my mom at one point goes, "Oh my gosh, you're going to ruin square dancing for everyone." And that was not my intention, but I think that once you know something, you have to talk about it.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, oh my gosh, you guys, this has been so wonderful having this opportunity to talk to each and every one of you. Your books are fantastic, and I hope everyone runs right out and picks them up. Well, for the ones that are available now, and the ones when they become available, gets them right away. So thank you so much. This has been great.
Lisa, thank
And
you
don't
so
forget to get
much.
Lisa's books either.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Middle
Thank
Ground
you.
Book Fest.